The boy's voice cracked like dry timber when he screamed it, and every single person within earshot of that dusty yard went absolutely still. "You are not my father. You will never be my father, and I hate you for even trying." Eli Whitaker, 9 years old and trembling with a grief that had no proper name yet, stood in the middle of Isaiah Ralston's front porch with tears carving clean tracks through the grime on his face. His fists were balled so tight his knuckles had gone white. He had knocked over the bucket of water Isaiah had been hauling from the well, and the water was soaking dark into the dry dirt of the yard, disappearing like it had never existed at all. Isaiah did not move. He stood 6 feet tall with his hat in his hands, broad shoulders squared, jaw set, and brown eyes holding every ounce of steadiness he possessed in the world. He had been hit before, physically, more times than he could count across his years of hard living in New Mexico territory, but nothing had landed quite like those words from that small, furious, heartbroken boy. Jane Whitaker stood in the doorway behind her son, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe, the other pressed to her mouth. Her dark hair was loose around her face, escaping the braid she had pinned up that morning before dawn. Her green eyes were wide and glassy with something that lived somewhere between terror and the deep, aching shame of a mother who watches her child bleed in a way she cannot stop. She had known this moment was coming. She had felt it building in Eli for 3 weeks, ever since they had arrived at Ralston's ranch. 3 weeks since she had made the most desperate, complicated decision of her life. 3 weeks of fragile mornings and tense evenings, and the boy sleeping with his boots on as though he needed to be ready to run at any moment. She had not known it would look like this. Isaiah crouched down. Not slowly, not with hesitation, but deliberately bringing himself to eye level with the furious child. The gesture was so unexpected that Eli actually stopped shouting and stared at him, breath hitching. "You are right," Isaiah said quietly. "I am not your father, I never claimed to be." Eli's chin wobbled. "Then stop acting like you care." Isaiah held the boy's gaze. Around them the wind moved through the high desert grass, and the horses shifted in the corral 50 yards away, and the whole world seemed to pause and wait. "I cannot replace your father," Isaiah said. "That is the God's honest truth, and I would not insult you by pretending otherwise. But Eli," he paused, "I can show you what steady looks like, if you will let me." The boy stared at him for one long, scorching moment. Then he turned and ran toward the barn, and the door slammed behind him, and the yard went quiet. Isaiah rose slowly. He put his hat back on his head. He looked at Jane standing in the doorway, and the expression on his face was not defeat. It was patience. It was a kind of love she had not believed men like him were capable of. That was the moment Jane Whitaker understood that she was in serious trouble, because she was falling for him, and the timing could not possibly have been worse. It had started 8 weeks earlier, on a coach road outside of Santa Fe, with a letter she should never have written. The year was 1873, and Jane Whitaker was 31 years old, widowed for 14 months and down to her last $4.23. She had a 9-year-old boy, a broken-down wagon with a cracked axle, and a piece of land in the Pecos Valley she had inherited from her husband Thomas, who had died in a riding accident that nobody in the territory talked about with full honesty, because Thomas Whitaker had not been entirely sober when he fell. She did not hate Thomas for that. She had loved him genuinely in the uneven and complicated way that 2 young people from Ohio love each other when they are 19, and the whole world seems full of impossible promise. They had come west in 1864 when Eli was still a thought in the future, chasing the idea of land and open sky that Thomas had read about in a newspaper. They had built something together, slowly, painfully, one fence post and one dry season and one near disaster at a time. Thomas had been charming and funny and fundamentally unreliable, and Jane had learned to carry more than her share without resentment, mostly because she loved the life they were building even when she did not love the man with total certainty. When he died in the autumn of 1871, she had grieved him truly and deeply, and she had also, in the private dark of nights she told no one about, felt the terrifying flutter of a woman realizing she was on her own. Eli had been devastated. The boy had worshipped Thomas in the uncomplicated way that sons worship fathers who are full of jokes and big gestures and promises, even when those promises sometimes evaporated before morning. The grief in him was enormous and consuming, and it had not lessened in 14 months. If anything, it had calcified into something harder, like a stone he carried everywhere. Jane's land in the Pecos Valley was not enough to survive on alone. She had 160 acres, but the cattle she had managed to keep after Thomas's death were down to 11 head, 3 of which were in poor health, and the well on the property had gone bad the previous spring. She had been paying her neighbor Harlan Greer to let her draw from his well, until Harlan had made clear, in a conversation that made her skin crawl, that he expected a different kind of payment than coin. She had refused him flatly and walked home through the dark and sat at her kitchen table and made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff in the certain knowledge that she might not survive the fall. She had written an advertisement. She placed it through an agency in Santa Fe, one of the frontier matrimonial bureaus that had been operating in New Mexico territory since the late 1860s. The advertisement was honest to the point of being almost reckless. It described her real situation. Widow, 31, one son age 9, small cattle operation in need of strong hand and honest partnership. I am not asking for a savior. I am asking for a partner who understands that a life built in the high desert requires 2 people who trust each other completely. I am a hard worker, a fair-minded person, and I will not waste your time with pretense. She had received 11 responses. 9 of them had been immediately discarded for reasons that ranged from alarming to absurd. One man had written to say he would take the boy off her hands first thing. Another had described himself as a God-fearing man, and then spent 4 pages of his letter condemning virtually every person he had ever met. The 10th letter had been from a man in Albuquerque who seemed perfectly reasonable, and who she had written back to, cautiously, twice, before she received information from a woman in Albuquerque who had recognized the name from the advertisement and written to warn her, woman to stranger, that the man had a dark past involving a previous wife who had left him under circumstances that were not discussed in polite company. The 11th letter had come from a man named Isaiah Ralston. He had a ranch outside a town called Copper Falls in the eastern portion of New Mexico territory, roughly 60 miles from Jane's property. He ran 300 head of cattle and owned the land outright, 240 acres with good water, a proper well, and a secondary creek that ran reliable most of the year. He was 34 years old. He had never been married. He wrote in a plain, careful hand, and his letter was exactly 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described his ranch and its practical situation without embellishment or exaggeration. The second paragraph described himself with the same directness. The third paragraph was the one that had stopped Jane cold when she read it. He had written, I am aware that a woman in your position has reasons to be cautious that go beyond the ordinary, and I want to be honest with you about something that is relevant. I was not raised in a stable home, and I know what the absence of steady presence does to a child. If you are considering this, I want you to know that the boy would be considered and respected, not tolerated. I have no experience being a father, which I mention not as a failing but as a fact you ought to have. The fourth paragraph contained his address and an invitation to write back if she saw fit, with no pressure implied or intended. She had read that letter 6 times before she wrote back. Their correspondence had lasted 3 weeks, 4 letters each, and by the time she received his 4th letter she had made up her mind in the way that someone makes up their mind when they already know the answer and are just allowing themselves time to confirm it. She had written back to propose a meeting. He had responded with directions to his ranch and a specific date in the middle of October 1873 when he would be there and ready to receive her. She had not told Eli the full truth about where they were going. That had been her first serious mistake. She had told him they were visiting a rancher who might be able to help them. She had told him it was a business arrangement. She had told him they would stay for a short while and see how things went. She had not told him that she had been exchanging letters with a man who might become their family, because she had not known how to say that sentence without it shattering something essential in her son's face. Eli had found out the truth from a boy in the neighboring town they had stopped in on their way north, who had heard his mother talking about the widow Whitaker going to marry the Ralston rancher. Children, as it turned out, were extraordinarily efficient at delivering information that their parents had been carefully managing. Eli had not spoken to Jane for the last 2 hours of the journey to the ranch. He had sat in the wagon with his arms crossed, and his face arranged into an expression of betrayal so complete and bottomless that she had had to keep her eyes on the road ahead to avoid losing her composure entirely. Isaiah Ralston had been waiting at the gate of his property when they arrived. He was lean and dark-haired with weathered skin and careful eyes, and he had removed his hat when the wagon stopped, and said good afternoon with a formality that was somehow simultaneously awkward and reassuring. He had looked at Eli with direct attention, not the performative warmth that adults often deployed on children they were trying to impress, but genuine acknowledgement, as though the boy were a full person whose opinion mattered. Eli had stared at him with all the hostile assessment a 9-year-old could muster, and said nothing. The first 3 weeks at the ranch had been a masterclass in tension. The property itself was beautiful in the spare, enormous way of the New Mexico high desert, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains visible to the north, and the land rolling out in waves of dry grass and scrub and red earth that caught the light in the late afternoon and turned colors that had no adequate name. The house was solid and well built, larger than Jane had expected, with a stone fireplace and proper windows and a kitchen that had clearly been constructed by someone who understood utility. Isaiah had arranged the household with a care that Jane found quietly startling. He had given Eli the better of the 2 spare rooms, the one with the east-facing window that got the morning light, and he had put a set of wooden shelves in it that he had clearly built recently because the wood still smelled of fresh cut, and the shavings were swept into the corner. He had not made a production of these things. He had simply done them. Jane and Isaiah were not married yet. That had been her insistence, and he had agreed without argument. They would meet, spend time together, determine if this was genuinely workable, and if it was, arrange for the justice of the peace in Copper Falls to make it official. There was no pressure from him on the timeline. There was no hidden agenda she could detect. There were no secrets he was withholding, at least not ones that had surfaced yet. What there was, instead, was a quality of presence in him that she had not expected and did not quite know how to categorize. He was not a man who filled a room with his personality. He was a man who filled a room with his attention. He listened when she spoke in a way that made her feel as though the words mattered, not in a flattering or practiced way, but in the way of someone who had decided that what other people said was worth the effort of actually hearing. He worked from before dawn until after dark, and he did not complain about it, and he did not expect praise for it. He showed her things about the ranch plainly and without condescension, how the water came down from the secondary creek through a channel he had dug himself over 2 seasons, how the cattle rotated through the different grazing sections, how the supply runs to Copper Falls happened every 2 weeks and what they typically required. He included her in these explanations not as someone being shown around a property she might be permitted to inhabit, but as a partner being briefed on an operation she would be part of running. She had not realized until then how much she had needed that, how completely Thomas's pattern of making decisions around her, and occasionally despite her, had settled into her bones as the way things were supposed to be. With Eli, Isaiah was consistent in a way that bordered on deliberate. He did not try to charm the boy. He did not bring him gifts or make special gestures designed to win approval. He simply treated Eli as a person whose presence on the ranch had a purpose and whose opinions were worth asking. He showed him how to check the horse's hooves for stones. He explained why the specific fence post near the north pasture needed to be replaced before the first freeze. He answered questions Eli asked with full answers, not simplified versions. Eli had, against his visible will, asked more questions as the days went on, but the grief in him was not quieted by consistency. It was, in some ways, made louder by it, because every time Isaiah did something good and reliable, it was a reminder of everything Thomas had not been, and that felt like betrayal in both directions at once. Betrayal of the father, he was mourning, and betrayal of the man that father had actually been. The explosion on the porch had been the outpouring of 3 weeks of that particular kind of agony. After Eli ran to the barn, Jane stepped down from the doorway and crossed the yard to where Isaiah stood. She stopped a few feet from him. The afternoon sun was going orange across the western sky, and the whole high desert was lit with it, and she looked at him and did not know how to begin. "I am sorry," she said. "Don't be." His voice was level. He needed to say it. "Isaiah, he is grieving, Jane." He looked at her steadily. "That kind of anger is not about me. It is about the fact that he cannot be angry at his father because his father is gone and I am here instead. I am a safe target. That is all right." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out toward the barn. "Because I was that boy," he said finally. "Not exactly the same, but close enough." She had known from his letters that his childhood had not been stable. He had mentioned it as a fact rather than a wound, in the way that people describe something they have examined enough times to have reached a truce with. He had not given her details, and she had not pressed, understanding instinctively that the information would come when he was ready to offer it. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, weighing something. Then he said, "Walk with me." They walked the length of the property, past the corral, and along the fence line toward the secondary creek, and he told her about his father, who had been a man of enormous force and charm, who had also been drunk more often than not, and who had left when Isaiah was 7, simply not come back one day, and his mother had spent the following decade waiting for a man who was never going to return. He had watched her wait, and he had learned, in the way that children learn the things that shape them entirely, that love without reliability was a kind of sustained cruelty. He had carried that knowledge into his adult life like a set of instructions, and it had made him solitary in a way that was not coldness but was, instead, a form of protection. He did not attach easily. He did not trust quickly. He had built his ranch alone over 8 years and had kept it alone, and had come, recently, to understand that he was lonely in a way that he could not solve by working harder. Jane listened to all of it walking beside him in the cooling evening air, and she felt something shifting in her chest, something that had been locked in the closed position for 14 months beginning to consider the possibility of opening. She told him, in return, about Thomas. About the version of Thomas that the world had seen, the version Eli remembered, and the version she had lived alongside. About the nights she had lain awake calculating how many months their money would last. About the particular loneliness of being married to someone who loved you but could not quite be counted on. About the guilt she still carried about the relief that had mixed into her grief when he died, and how she had never said that out loud before to anyone. He did not respond to that confession with reassurance or dismissal. He simply said, "That is an honest thing to admit." And the simplicity of it, the refusal to make it smaller or larger than it was, undid something in her completely. She did not cry. She was not, by disposition, a woman who cried easily, but she looked at him in the fading light by the creek and felt the full weight of the last 14 months settle into her bones and then, somehow, lighten. They walked back to the house as the stars came out, enormous and extravagant over the New Mexico dark. Eli was in his room when they returned, door shut, and the house was quiet in a way that felt suspended, like something waiting. Jane made supper. It was a simple meal, beans and cornbread and the dried beef they had brought from their property, and Isaiah set the table with the deliberate neatness of a man who had learned to keep order, because Order was the one thing he could always control. He knocked on Eli's door and said supper was ready. And after a long pause, the door opened and the boy came out with his eyes still red and his chin still set in the stubborn angle that was, Jane had always thought, the most Thomas-like thing about him. They ate in silence for several minutes. It was not an unbearable silence. It was the silence of three people who were all, in their different ways, trying to figure out how to be in the same room. Then Eli said, without looking up from his plate, "What happened to your horses?" Isaiah looked at him. "What do you mean? The marks on the two grays in the north corral, what happened?" Isaiah put his fork down. "Some men came through in late summer," he said. "They were running stolen horses and trying to blend them in with mine. I found out about it. There was a confrontation." Eli looked up. "What kind of confrontation?" "The kind where I asked them to leave and they declined the first 2 times." Something flickered in Eli's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but interest. "Were you scared?" Isaiah considered the question with the full seriousness that Eli had directed at it. "Yes," he said. "There were 3 of them. It would have been foolish not to be scared." Eli absorbed that. He went back to his food. After another moment he said very quietly, "My father was not scared of anything." Jane's throat tightened. Isaiah said, "Men who are not scared of anything often don't plan carefully enough." He picked up his fork again. "I prefer to be scared and still standing." Eli ate 3 more bites. He did not say anything else, but when he finished and put his plate in the basin, he paused at the door to his room and said, without turning around, "The fence post by the north pasture. You said it needed replacing before the freeze. I could help tomorrow if you want." He went into his room and closed the door. Jane looked at Isaiah across the table. He was looking at the door where the boy had disappeared, and on his face was an expression so careful and so private that she felt she had witnessed something she was not entirely supposed to see. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at it, then up at her, and the expression shifted into something quieter and more open than anything she had seen on his face before. "I am glad I wrote that letter," she said. "So am I," he said, "more than I expected to be." The next morning came in cold and bright, the high desert autumn having dropped the temperature overnight into something that bit at exposed skin and put frost on the ground. Isaiah was up before the sun as always, and Jane woke to the smell of coffee and came out to find him at the kitchen stove with his back to her, and the simple domesticity of it caught her completely off guard. She stood in the doorway in her wool wrapper and watched him for a moment without announcing herself, and she thought about the letter she had written in desperation at her kitchen table in the dark, and she thought about how that desperation had somehow, against all reasonable odds, led here, to this specific kitchen with this specific man, and she felt the sharp and particular terror of something that was starting to feel like hope. "Coffee is ready," he said, without turning around, because he had heard her footsteps. She came into the kitchen and poured herself a cup and stood at the window and looked out at the frost-silvered yard. "Eli will be up soon," she said. "Good." He turned from the stove. "There is a section of fence near the north pasture that genuinely needs attention. I was not just saying that to give him something to do. He will be useful." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "You were not patronizing him when you said it." "No, he would have known if you were." "I know." He poured his own coffee and came to stand beside her at the window, not touching her, simply nearby. "He is a perceptive boy, too perceptive for his own peace of mind sometimes. That tends to be the case with perceptive people." She smiled despite herself, because it was clearly as much a comment about her as about Eli, and he knew she had taken it that way, and the small shared knowledge of that was, she thought, the first genuinely uncomplicated moment they had had together. The fence work that morning was a turning point of a different kind, though it did not announce itself as such. Isaiah set Eli to holding the post sections while he dug, and then to packing the dirt back around the base, and he talked while he worked. Not a steady stream of instruction, but an intermittent commentary on the land and the cattle and the various problems he had solved and not solved since building the ranch. He talked to Eli the way he would have talked to a fellow adult, which was to say clearly and without simplification. And Eli responded to this with the focused attentiveness of someone who had been waiting to be taken seriously. Jane worked alongside them, driving nails and holding the top rail while Isaiah hammered, and the three of them moved through the morning work in a rhythm that was new and awkward. And underneath that awkwardness, something she recognized as the first faint outline of a pattern. At noon they came in for a meal, and Eli was flushed from the cold air, and talking more than he had in 3 weeks, asking Isaiah about the cattle brands and what the process was for registering a brand with the territorial authority, and whether the secondary creek ever flooded in the spring melt. Isaiah answered each question with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and Jane sat across from them and felt something enormous and terrifying expanding in her chest. She was falling in love with him. She had not planned for it. She had planned for a partnership. She had planned for stability and shared effort and a reasonable companionship. She had written that first letter specifically because she was tired of dreaming about things that could not be relied upon, and a practical arrangement between two honest people had seemed so much safer than the risk of actual feeling. Isaiah Ralston had made a poor partnership candidate, it turned out, not because he was unreliable or dishonest or difficult, but because he was, in the most inconveniently complete way, exactly the kind of man she had stopped believing existed. She did not say any of this. She passed the bread and asked about the cattle rotation and kept her face arranged in the expression of a woman conducting a reasonable assessment of a practical situation. That afternoon, while Eli was in the barn helping the ranch hand, a young Navajo man named Tamaz, who had worked for Isaiah for 2 years and who had taken a cautious but genuine interest in the boy's education about horses, Jane found herself alone with Isaiah in the kitchen going over the accounts. The ranch finances were solid. Isaiah kept careful books, the ledgers written in his plain, deliberate hand, and the operation showed a real and sustainable profit despite the hard years of the early 1870s cattle market. He walked her through the numbers without any of the vagueness or deflection that Thomas had always deployed when finances were involved, and the transparency of it was almost disorienting. "You need to understand all of this," he said, "because if anything happens to me, the ranch should still function. You need to know how it works." She looked at him. "Nothing is going to happen to you. Something always has the potential to happen." He met her eyes. "I am not saying that to be grim. I am saying it because I know what it is to be left without information, and I will not put someone I care about in that position. Someone I care about." He had said it simply as a fact, and she felt it land somewhere deep. "Isaiah," she set down the pencil she had been holding, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right. Are there things about yourself, about your past, that you have not told me, hidden things, things that would change what I think of this arrangement?" She held his gaze. "I am not accusing you of anything. I need to know because I am not only making a decision for myself." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched something move through his expression, something careful and weighted. "There is one thing," he said. Her heart rate shifted. "The men who came through in late summer with the stolen horses," he said. "One of them was a man named Curtis Wade. He is not a man who accepts being told to leave gracefully. He went to Copper Falls and told people that I had stolen his horses, which is the opposite of the truth, but he is convincing, and he knows people in the territory who will support his version of events. I have had no legal trouble from it. The sheriff in Copper Falls knows my reputation and his, but Wade has not gone away. He has been seen twice in the last month within 10 miles of this property." Jane sat with that information. "You were going to tell me this. I was going to tell you today. I wanted to wait until I understood whether he was a passing threat or something more persistent before I brought it to you. You should have told me immediately." "Yes, no hesitation. You are right, I should have. I was trying to assess the situation before worrying you with it, and that was the wrong instinct." The acknowledgement, immediate and undefended, was so different from the conversations she had always had about the things Thomas had not told her that she almost did not know how to respond to it. "If Wade comes back," she said, "what does that look like?" "I don't know yet. It could be nothing. Men like him often move on when there is easier trouble to make elsewhere. But I will not have you and Eli here without knowing what you might be facing." She nodded slowly. "All right, thank you for telling me. I will not keep things from you, Jane. Whatever else I am uncertain about, I am certain of that." She looked at him for a long time in the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, and she thought about what it would mean to genuinely trust someone. Not the careful, provisional trust she had extended over years to Thomas, always with the silent reservation of the knowledge that the ground might shift, but the full, open-handed trust of someone who had been given real evidence that the other person was worth it. She was not there yet, but she could see, for the first time, the road that led there. Over the following 10 days, the shape of their life together at the ranch settled into something that had both the awkwardness of the new and the surprising ease of the compatible. Jane took over the management of the kitchen and the household accounts with Isaiah's full participation, and without any of the territorial friction she had half expected. He was not a man who had set things up a certain way and resented interference. He was a man who had set things up as practically as he could alone, and was genuinely open to it being done better. She reorganized the storage pantry, and he helped her move the shelving without being asked. She identified that the root cellar had a drainage problem that would cause loss of stored vegetables through the winter, and he had it fixed within 2 days, bringing in Tamaz and a friend from Copper Falls to do the work properly. She proposed a different rotation schedule for the cattle that she had used on her own land with good results, and he sat with her at the table in the evening and looked at it seriously and asked 3 questions, and then said he thought it had genuine merit and would they try it on the south section first. Eli, watching all of this with the vigilant attention of a child who had learned that adult arrangements were things that happened to him rather than things he was consulted about, began to show the slow, reluctant signs of a person who is trying very hard not to be comforted, and finding that the effort requires more energy than they have. He and Tamaz had developed a genuine friendship. Tamaz was 22, quiet and perceptive, and he treated Eli with the same matter-of-fact seriousness that Isaiah did, and the two of them spent considerable time in the barn and around the horses, Tamaz teaching Eli the things he knew about horses and the land with the patience of someone who loved both. This opened other conversations, and Eli came to Jane one evening with questions about the Navajo people and the territory that showed he had been listening carefully to things Tamaz had told him, questions about the long walk and what had happened to the Navajo people and why things were the way they were. Jane answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging the terrible injustice of what had been done, and the conversation went on until well past Eli's usual bedtime, both of them sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight. Isaiah joined them for part of it, and Jane noticed that he spoke about it with the same directness he brought to everything, acknowledging the wrongs plainly, without the deflection or the managed discomfort that most white people in the territory displayed when the subject came up. After Eli went to bed, Jane sat with Isaiah at the table and said, "You and Tamaz have a real friendship." "We do." He was quiet a moment. "He came to work here 3 years ago after his family's situation became difficult. He is one of the best horsemen in this part of the territory, and he is wasted in a lot of the work he ends up doing for men who do not acknowledge what he knows. I try not to be that kind of employer. Does he know we are?" She paused, not quite sure what word to use. "He knows the situation. He has been tactful about it. What does he think?" Isaiah looked at her with a faint edge of something that was almost amusement. "He told me I had better not ruin it." She felt the warmth of that rise in her face and was grateful for the low lamplight. "I am going to need to think about the practical arrangements," she said, bringing herself back to solid ground. "If we are going to do this formally, if I am going to legally take whatever time you need. It is not only my time to take, it involves you and it involves Eli." "Yes." He looked at the table between them, And I will not pretend that I am entirely without preferences on the subject of the timeline. She looked at him directly. What are your preferences? He met her eyes, and the steadiness of his gaze was something she was still learning to accept, still learning to hold without flinching. I would like for this to be settled, he said, not because I am impatient, because I think settled is better for all of us, particularly for Eli. Children move forward better when the ground under them stops shifting. She thought about that for a long time after she went to her room. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the wind in the high desert dark and thought about what it meant to make a decision that could not be undone, and whether she was capable of making it with her whole heart rather than only with the half that was practical and careful and afraid. She thought she was. She was not entirely sure, but she thought she was. 3 days later, Curtis Wade rode onto the property. He came at midday with 2 other men, none of them hiding the fact that they were armed, riding in through the front gate with the casual arrogance of men who had decided they had nothing to lose from being seen. Isaiah was in the north pasture when Jane spotted them from the kitchen window, and she felt the cold instant understanding that this was a situation that required clear action. She found Isaiah's spare rifle behind the kitchen door where he had told her it was on the 2nd day of her arrival. She checked that it was loaded, which it was. She walked out onto the porch. Wade was a tall, lean man in his mid-40s with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something harder and more calculating. He reined his horse at the yard gate and looked at her with undisguised assessment. "Ma'am," he said, "I am looking for Isaiah Ralston." "He is not here presently," Jane said. The rifle was across her arm in a way that was not quite a threat but was absolutely not an accident. "What is your business?" "My business is with him, not with you. This is my property as well," she said, which was not technically true yet but was, she had decided, close enough for the current purpose. "You can state your business with me or you can leave." Wade's expression shifted, reading her. She held his gaze with the full steadiness she possessed. "You tell him Curtis Wade came by," Wade said. "You tell him I want what is owed to me. He will know what that means." "I will tell him you trespassed on this property," Jane said, "and that you were asked to leave. That is what he will hear." Wade stared at her for a long moment. His 2 companions were still watching. The whole yard was sharp with tension and the particular quality of silence that existed in the high desert when something dangerous was deciding which way to move. Then Wade smiled, which was the most frightening thing he had done yet, and turned his horse. They rode out. Jane stood on the porch until they were through the gate and down the road and out of sight. Then she went back inside and put the rifle back behind the door and stood at the kitchen window with her hands pressed flat on the counter, breathing carefully until her heart rate returned to something manageable. Isaiah came back from the north pasture 20 minutes later and she told him exactly what had happened. He listened without interruption, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and when she finished he said, "You handled that right. How serious is he?" Isaiah set his hat on the table. "Serious enough that I need to speak to the sheriff in Copper Falls tomorrow, and I need Tamaz to stay on the property while I am gone." "What does he want from you, truly?" "Ran about 40 horses through here in August. I did not know they were stolen until his buyer arrived after they had already been on my land for 3 days. When I understood the situation, I told him he needed to take them and leave and never come back. He lost the sale because of the delay and the fact that the buyer became suspicious. He blames me for that loss." Jane was quiet, thinking through the implications. The buyer was anyone from the territorial authority involved in investigating. The sheriff looked into it. The horses were identified as stolen from a ranch in Texas. Wade was questioned but not arrested because he had gone to ground by then and there was not enough direct evidence. His jaw tightened. "He has been operating like this for years. He is not a careless man. He is a man who is used to there being no consequences," Jane said. "That kind of man is dangerous precisely because he is not used to being told no." Isaiah looked at her with that quality of direct attention she was learning was his particular way of indicating that what she had just said mattered. "Yes," he said, Exactly that. Then we deal with it directly, she said. You go to the sheriff. You give him everything you have. We do not wait and hope he decides this is not worth his time. He said. She heard the weight of it. She said. The trip to Copper Falls the next morning was the first time Jane and Isaiah had been in town together, and the experience was instructive. Copper Falls was a town of about 300 people, with a main street of timber-framed buildings that included a dry goods store, a barber, a saloon, a small bank, and the sheriff's office, which was a solid brick building that Isaiah told her had been built specifically because the previous wooden one had been set on fire twice. The town had the functional, slightly battered quality of a frontier settlement that had survived its early disasters and was in the process of deciding whether to become something more permanent. People noticed them together. Jane observed this without self-consciousness, and with the practical understanding that news traveled at the speed of conversation in small towns, and that the story of the widow Whitaker at the Ralston ranch was probably already well established as a topic of interest. She held her head up and walked alongside Isaiah with the matter-of-fact confidence of a woman who had made a decision. She stood behind. The sheriff was a heavy-set man named Abernathy who had the weathered permanence of someone who had been doing his job for a long time and intended to continue. He listened to Isaiah with the attention of a person who was already familiar with the situation and had formed opinions about it. He asked several precise questions, wrote several notes, and told them that he had been tracking Wade's activities across 3 counties and that the case against him was building but was not yet complete. The problem, Abernathy said, leaning back in his chair, is that Wade has friends in Albuquerque who are willing to speak to his character, with more social standing than the evidence against him at the present moment. He threatened my property, Isaiah said, in front of a witness. Abernathy looked at Jane. He came to the property with 2 armed men, Jane said, identified himself by name, stated that there was something owed to him, and left after being asked to leave. I can put that in writing. Abernathy studied her for a moment. You are prepared to give a sworn statement, ma'am? Yes, she said. I am. He nodded slowly. That helps. It establishes a pattern and it is a corroborated account. Give me a week to put this together properly. They rode back from Copper Falls in the early afternoon, and the conversation on the road was quieter, both of them sitting with what had been decided. The sky was enormous and clear overhead, the kind of New Mexico October sky that seemed to have more blue in it than was entirely reasonable, and the land stretched out in every direction with its spare, inhospitable beauty. Thank you, Isaiah said after several miles of silence. You do not need to thank me. I do. He kept his eyes on the road. I have been handling things alone for a long time. It takes adjustment having someone who steps in alongside you. She looked at the side of his face. I know what you mean. I imagine you do. It is going to require us both to learn something, she said. How to do things together when we have both spent years doing everything ourselves. Is that something you are willing to learn? She thought about it seriously because he deserved a serious answer. Yes, she said. I am. He did not look at her, but she saw his hands relax on the reins, and it was the clearest expression of relief she had yet seen from him. That evening after supper, when Eli was in his room and the house had settled into its night sounds, Isaiah asked Jane to come sit on the porch. The temperature had dropped and they sat with the wool blanket from the porch bench across their laps, not touching, looking out at the star-heavy sky. I want to say something to you, he said. All right. I know that what brought you here was necessity. I am not romantic about the circumstances. He paused. But I need you to know that what has developed for me in these weeks is not something I manufactured to make the arrangement work. It is real, and it is more than I expected when I wrote that letter. Jane looked at the night sky. The stars in the high desert were a different thing entirely from anywhere else she had lived. They were close and specific, each one a point of actual light rather than a generalized shimmer. Isaiah, she turned her head to look at him. I am going to say something I have been afraid to say. He waited. I am in love with you, she said. I was not planning to be. I was planning to be reasonable and practical and to make a good decision carefully. And then you were the kind of man who tells a grieving child the truth about being scared and lets him hear it as something other than weakness. And that was, as it turns out, the thing that undid me completely. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to make her heart rate spike. Then he turned and looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, an expression that was completely unguarded, all of the careful composure stripped away. And what was underneath it was something so genuine and so intense that she had to take a breath. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the third letter you wrote me, when you told me that the land in the Pecos Valley was beautiful in a way that made you angry sometimes because something that beautiful deserved better than to be struggled over." He paused. "I thought that was the truest thing I had ever read about this territory." She felt the laugh come up unexpectedly, warm and real. "That is a specific thing to fall in love with someone over," she said. "I am a specific person," he said. She reached across and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, and they sat in the cold and the star-filled dark and were still together in a way that felt, for the first time in an extremely long time, like exactly enough. In the morning, Jane told Eli she needed to speak with him, and they sat at the kitchen table together while Isaiah was out checking the cattle, and she told him the truth this time, all of it. She told him about the advertisement and the letters. She told him about why she had made the choice she had. She told him about her own fear and the mistakes she had made and how she had presented the situation to him. She did not make excuses. She apologized for the deception directly, and she told him that whatever he felt about it was reasonable and she was not going to argue with it. Eli listened with his hands flat on the table, staring at the grain of the wood. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Do you love him?" "Yes," she said. "I do." He was quiet again. "Does he love you?" "He does." Another silence. "He said he cannot replace my father. He told you that himself." "Yes. But he is going to be here." Eli's voice was careful, feeling for the edges of something. "Every day, he is going to be the person who is here." "Yes. That is different from my father." He looked up at her. "My father was sometimes here and sometimes not." She held his gaze. "Yes, that is different." Eli looked back down at the table. His finger traced the wood grain slowly. "Tomas says that Mr. Ralston is the most reliable person he has ever worked for. He said he has been here every day for 3 years and he has never once said he would do something and then not done it." Jane felt the tightening in her throat. "Tomas says that matters," Eli said, "more than a lot of other things." "Tomas is wise," she said softly. Eli sat for a long time. Then he said, "I still miss my father. I know. I am going to keep missing him. You should, you always should." He looked at her. "But that does not mean I have to be angry at Mr. Ralston." She reached across and put her hand over his, the same gesture she had made to Isaiah the previous week, and felt the echo of it like a thread connecting them all. "No," she said, "it does not." Eli nodded slowly. He got up from the table and went to the door and then stopped, and without turning around said, "I told him yesterday that I hated him. I need to tell him I did not mean it." "He knows you did not mean it." "That does not mean I do not need to say it." He opened the door and went out, and she watched through the window as he walked across the yard in the morning light toward the north pasture where Isaiah was working. She could not hear what was said. She watched Eli approach him, watched Isaiah stop what he was doing and turn and listen, watched the boy standing straight and the man crouching down again to eye level. The conversation was brief. When it was over, Isaiah put his hand on the boy's shoulder, briefly, and Eli turned and looked back at the house, and Jane saw on her son's face something that she had not seen in a very long time. The beginning of ease. The weeks that followed were full and complicated, and sometimes hard, and also, underneath all of it, permeated with a quality of rightness that Jane had never expected to find, and had stopped expecting long before she came to this place. The Curtis Wade situation resolved 12 days later. Sheriff Abernathy, with Jane's written statement and additional evidence gathered from a rancher in a neighboring county who had also had a confrontation with Wade's operation, brought a formal charge against Wade and his associates for cattle theft and horse theft, and presented it to a territorial judge in Santa Fe. Wade was arrested in early November. The two men who had ridden with him onto Isaiah's property were part of the same arraignment. The case, Abernathy told them when he rode out to the ranch with the news, was solid. Isaiah stood at the gate hearing this, and his face did something that Jane had not expected. He looked not triumphant but simply relieved, in the deep, uncomplicated way of a man who has been holding something tight for a long time and has just been given permission to let it go. Abernathy tipped his hat to Jane before he rode back out. "Good instinct on the statement, ma'am," he said. "It made the difference in corroborating the pattern." When he was gone, Isaiah turned and looked at her. "I told you we would deal with it," she said. He crossed the yard and stood in front of her and took her face in both his hands, carefully, the way you hold something that matters, and he kissed her for the first time, there in the yard in the November morning with the frost still on the ground and the mountains visible to the north, and Eli watching from the barn door with an expression of deeply studious neutrality. It was a good kiss. It was a thorough, honest, deliberate kiss, and it contained within it all of the accumulated weight of weeks of carefully maintained propriety and the full force of what both of them had been saying without saying it. And when it ended they were both somewhat breathless, which she found she did not mind at all. From the barn door, Eli said, "Tamaz said this was going to happen." Isaiah looked over his shoulder at the boy. "Did he?" He said probably before the first snow. Eli studied the sky with elaborate unconcern. He was going to win a bet about it, but there is nobody here to bet with. Isaiah turned back to Jane. His eyes were warm and amused in something else, something deeper than either, and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heart beating. "We should talk to the justice of the peace," she said. "Yes," he said, "we should." They were married on a Thursday in the middle of November 1873, in the small justice of the peace office in Copper Falls, with Tamaz and Abernathy's wife as witnesses and Eli standing beside his mother in his best shirt with his hair, combed with a thoroughness that indicated both Isaiah's prior instruction and his own unacknowledged investment in the occasion. The ceremony was brief and plain. Jane and Isaiah made their promises to each other in the direct, unadorned language of two people who had thought carefully about what promises mean and were making them with full awareness. When it was done and the papers were signed, and the justice of the peace shook Isaiah's hand, Eli said quietly to his mother that it was a good thing they had done, and she put her arm around him and held him close. They ate supper at the hotel dining room in Copper Falls that evening, the four of them including Tamaz, and the meal was warm and long and full of conversation. And Eli fell asleep on the wagon ride home with his head against his mother's arm, and Isaiah drove with the particular quiet alertness of someone who is entirely aware of being exactly where they are supposed to be. The winter at the ranch was the best winter Jane had spent in years. The house was warm and well-stocked. The cattle weathered the early cold well under the rotation schedule she had proposed, and the daily rhythms of the life they were building together had the quality she had been seeking without knowing its name. Steadiness, not the static, airless steadiness of things that never change, but the active, chosen steadiness of people who have decided to show up for each other day after day and mean it. Isaiah and Eli continued to develop their relationship with the same careful, incrementally building quality it had always had. There were no grand gestures, no overreaching declarations. Isaiah taught Eli to track weather by the behavior of the cattle, to read the creek for signs of upstream conditions, to do the basic maintenance on the wagons and the tools. He answered every question Eli asked him. He came to watch Eli ride in the corral and told him afterward with precision and without flattery exactly what he was doing well and what he needed to work on. One evening in January, Eli came to Isaiah in the kitchen where he was working on the ledgers and said, with the directness that was increasingly his particular style, "I want to learn to do what you do with the books." Isaiah looked up. "Why?" "Because if anything happened to you or my mother," Eli said, with the particular 9-year-old matter-of-factness that was more devastating than dramatics, "someone would need to know how it works." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. Then he moved his chair to make room and said, "Pull up a seat." Jane, who had been listening from the hallway, pressed her knuckles against her mouth and stood there in the dark for a long moment before she trusted herself to walk back to the bedroom. By February, the ranch felt entirely like home. Not the strained, achieved version of home where you tell yourself you have adjusted, but the real version where you stop noticing the specific details because they have become the background of your life. Eli's grief for Thomas had not disappeared. Jane did not expect it to and did not want it to. But it had changed shape, become less like an open wound and more like a scar, present and permanent and part of him but no longer bleeding. He talked about his father sometimes, stories and memories, and Isaiah listened to these stories with genuine interest and never deflected them and never competed with them. And this was, Jane thought, one of the most remarkable things about him. He had no need to displace Thomas from Eli's heart. He had, with complete confidence, built his own place there, and the two things existed without contradiction. In March, Jane realized she was pregnant. She told Isaiah on a Tuesday morning before the rest of the household was awake, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and she told him simply and directly, as she did everything. The look on his face was something she would carry for the rest of her life. It was not the performance of joy, the exaggerated response of a man playing the correct social role. It was genuine, unguarded, completely human joy, slightly terrifying in its intensity, quickly modulated by the concern of a practical man who understood what this meant and what it required. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "We need to determine the situation with the doctor in Copper Falls." He was already thinking forward, organizing. "And the timing with the spring cattle work, Isaiah," she said. He stopped. "You are allowed to simply feel this for a moment," she said. He looked at her. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and then he said, "I am going to be a father." His voice was careful with it, like he was learning the word's weight. "You are going to be a father." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I want to do it differently than it was done for me." "I know," she said. "You already are." Eli took the news with characteristic deliberateness. He thought about it for the better part of a day, then came to the supper table and announced that if it was a boy he thought it should be named after Thomas, because that was the right thing to do, and if it was a girl he thought Jane and Isaiah should decide that between themselves. Jane looked at him across the table. "That is a generous thing to suggest," she said. Eli shrugged with elaborate unconcern. "My father should not be forgotten," he said. "And it does not mean Isaiah is less." He looked at Isaiah directly. "It would be like how the ranch is both yours and my mother's. Two things can both be real at the same time." Isaiah held the boy's gaze for a long moment, and Jane saw something pass between them that had no words and did not need any. "I would be honored to name a son for your father," Isaiah said. Eli nodded once. He went back to his food. After a moment he said, "I am going to teach him about horses before he can walk if possible." And the table dissolved into laughter, and that laughter was so full and real and present that Jane felt it in her bones like warmth. The spring came in with the particular intensity of the New Mexico high desert, the land shifting from its winter restraint into a brash, overflowing aliveness, the creek running high with snowmelt from the mountains, the cattle restless and eager, the mornings cold, and the afternoons blazing with a sun that was already taking on its summer weight. The ranch work in spring was relentless, and Jane worked alongside Isaiah through all of it, scaling back her physical labor as the months advanced, and her pregnancy became more evident, but not withdrawing from the operation. She managed the accounts, organized the supply runs, maintained the communication with the buyers in Albuquerque that Isaiah's cattle sales depended on, and kept the household running with the efficiency that was, she had discovered, one of the genuine pleasures of having a properly provisioned household for the first time in years. Isaiah, meanwhile, was quietly becoming someone she found more remarkable with each passing season. He was not perfect. He had a tendency toward silence when he should speak, a leftover from years of handling everything alone, and Jane had learned to read the particular quality of his silences and to ask direct questions when she suspected the silence was concealing something that needed to be said. He sometimes pushed himself past the point of exhaustion on the theory that the work required it, and she had, on several occasions, had to be entirely plain with him about the fact that she needed him healthy more than she needed the back fence line repaired before sunrise. He received these corrections with the same immediacy he brought to everything, without defensiveness, genuinely taking in what she said. She was not perfect either. She had years of doing everything her own way at her own pace, and the process of genuinely consulting another person rather than simply informing them after the fact was something she was still actively learning. She had twice made significant decisions about the household accounts without discussing them with Isaiah first, and both times he had noted this quietly and she had acknowledged it directly and they had moved forward. No recriminations, no scorekeeping. Just two people working on the same problem. In July, a letter arrived from her property in the Pecos Valley. Her neighbor there, a woman named Mrs. Catton, who had been keeping a general eye on the land in Jane's absence, wrote to say that Harlan Greer, the neighbor who had made his unpleasant proposition to Jane, had recently been found to have been obtaining land through fraudulent means and had been brought before a territorial court, and that Jane's land was in no danger, but that she ought to be aware of the situation, and that several people in the valley had spoken well of her handling of Greer when he had approached her. Jane read the letter at the kitchen table and then handed it to Isaiah. He read it and looked up at her. "You never told me about Greer," he said. "I told you enough to explain the situation with the well." She paused. "I did not tell you the specifics of what he proposed." "Tell me now," he said. She told him. His jaw tightened as she described the conversation. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You handled that alone," he said. "I had to at the time. You do not have to handle anything alone anymore." His voice was level, but the feeling underneath it was not. "I am not going to pursue that on your behalf without your direction. But I want you to know that if you need anything done about that man or anyone like him, I am here for it." She looked at him. The protective fierceness of it, carefully controlled but entirely present, moved something in her. "I know you are," she said. "That is the thing I have been learning all year, that you are here." Their son was born in the last week of October 1874, 1 year after Jane had arrived at the ranch. He came in the early hours of a Wednesday morning, with the assistance of a midwife from Copper Falls named Mrs. Varga, a competent and unflappable Bohemian woman who had delivered a significant portion of the region's children, and who treated the entire process with the brisk confidence of long experience. Isaiah was in the kitchen for most of it, in the way that men of that time and place were kept out of the room, and when Mrs. Varga came to the door and told him he had a son, he stood up from the kitchen chair and put his hands on the table and said, very quietly, "A son. Healthy," she said, "and your wife is well. Go see them." He went in and stood at the bedside, and Jane looked up at him from the exhaustion and the enormous fact of what had just happened and handed him the bundle, and he took his son with the careful, complete attentiveness he brought to everything, and he looked at the small, sleeping face for a long moment. "Thomas," he said. The name settled in the room, honoring what it was meant to honor. Jane reached up and touched his hand. "Thomas Isaiah," she said. "Both." He looked at her over their son's head, and she saw his eyes were bright. "Thomas Isaiah Ralston," he said. From the doorway, Eli, who had been awake through all of it in the barely controlled terror of a child who loves his mother and understands enough to be afraid, said, "Can I see him?" Isaiah turned and brought the baby to his brother, And Eli stood very straight and looked at the new face with an expression of tremendous solemnity that shifted slowly into something astonished and soft. "He is very small," Eli said. "He will get larger," Isaiah said. "He looks like he could be anybody." "He will figure out who he is," Isaiah said. "Give him time." Eli looked up at him. "Like me." "Like all of us," Isaiah said. Eli reached out one finger and touched the baby's small fist, and the baby's fist closed around it with the reflexive, absolute grip of the newborn. And Eli's face did something unguarded and complete, the armor of the grieving child letting down entirely for one honest moment. "I am going to take care of him," Eli said. "I know you are," Isaiah said. The following years at the ranch were the years Jane would look back on as the foundation of everything. She did not look back on them as perfect, because she was too honest a person for that, and because they were not perfect. There were hard winters and poor seasons and arguments that required real effort to resolve, and the ordinary friction of people learning each other's most difficult qualities over time. There were nights she was lonely for things she could not name, and nights Isaiah retreated into the silence that was his oldest way of managing difficulty, and the work of pulling him back into conversation was real work. But the foundation of what they had built together was solid in the way that Isaiah had always intended to be solid, and it held under the weight of all of it. Thomas Isaiah grew into a child who was loud and curious, and who had his mother's green eyes and his namesake's generous charm, which manifested in the 4-year-old as an inability to pass a horse, a dog, or a stranger without attempting to initiate a thorough conversation. He followed Eli everywhere and worshipped him with the uncomplicated devotion of a younger sibling, and Eli, who had become at 13 a serious and perceptive young man with a real gift for the ranching work, bore this devotion with a mixture of impatience and fierce protectiveness that was, Jane thought, one of the more beautiful things she had ever watched. In 1877, Jane found she was pregnant again. This time she told Isaiah in the evening, sitting on the porch in the summer warmth, and he took it in with the same quality of quiet, full attention, and this time there was no wondering what it meant. He simply held her hand and said, "Good," in the voice of a man who meant it completely. This child, born in the spring of 1878, was a girl. They named her Clara. She arrived with red-tinged hair, and a disposition from her first hours that suggested opinions she intended to make known at regular intervals. And Isaiah held her with the same careful completeness he had brought to Thomas, and looked at Jane over their daughter's head with an expression she had learned to read as the full, unguarded version of him, the man underneath the competence and the steadiness, the man who had grown up without a father and had decided to become the thing he had never been given. Eli, 15 by then and no longer the same boy who had screamed on the porch that his father could not be replaced, held his sister with a gentleness that made Jane press the back of her hand to her mouth to keep from crying, and said to Isaiah, "I think she looks like you a little bit." Isaiah looked at the baby. "She looks like her mother." "The stubbornness is from you," Eli said. Isaiah laughed, a full real laugh, and Jane sat in her bed with her family around her, and thought about the letter she had written in desperation at a kitchen table in the dark, and how little she had believed in that moment that anything good could come from it, and how wrong she had been. To Maz, who had remained at the ranch through all of it and had become as much a part of their family as anyone, attended the celebration they held 2 days after Clara's birth, and brought a gift he had made himself, a small wooden horse carved with the extraordinary care he brought to fine work, and set it on the dresser in the nursery without comment. In the summer of 1879, Eli Whitaker, now 16, stood at the fence of the north pasture with Isaiah and told him that he wanted to learn the full management of the ranch. Not the day-to-day work, which he already knew as well as anyone. He meant the whole of it. The business side, the land management, the relationships with buyers and with the territorial authority, all of it. Isaiah looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" he said. "Because this is my family's land," Eli said. It was the first time he had used that word without qualification, without the careful hedge of my mother's or the Ralston ranch. The first time he had simply claimed it. And because when you are old I am going to need to run it. Isaiah was quiet for what felt like a long time. The wind moved through the high desert grass, and the mountains stood blue to the north, and the cattle moved in the south pasture. "When I am old," he said. "You are already getting old," Eli said with the deadpan of his mother. "It is a valid concern." Isaiah looked at the mountains. There was something on his face that was not entirely composed, and Jane, who was watching from the kitchen window 50 yards away, saw it from a distance and understood what it was. It was the thing he had been working toward without knowing, or perhaps knowing perfectly well, since the first day a furious small boy had stood on his porch and told him he could not be replaced. It was a rival. "All right," Isaiah said. "We start tomorrow." Eli nodded. He turned and went toward the barn in the manner of someone who has accomplished what they came to do. He paused at the barn door and looked back. "Isaiah," he said. Isaiah turned. "I know you said you could not replace my father," Eli said. "You were right about that. You did not replace him." He paused, and there was something in his face that was entirely his own, entirely the person he had become in the years since he arrived at this ranch with his boots on and his heart locked up. "But you are my father. That is just what the word means to me now. I wanted you to know that." He went into the barn. Isaiah stood at the fence for a long time after. When Jane came out of the house and walked to him across the yard, he did not say anything, and she did not require him to. She stood beside him at the fence and looked at the mountains to the north, and he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the sun was going orange across the western sky the way it had gone that afternoon 2 years before when he had first told her about his own father, and the world was full and enormous around them. "Are you all right?" she said. "More than all right," he said. "More than I ever expected to be." She put her arm around his waist and they stood in the last warmth of the afternoon sun. And from the barn came the sound of Eli's voice and Thomas's higher laugh and Clara's imperious contribution, and the horses shifting in the corral, and Tomás saying something in the easy mixture of Spanish and English he used with the children, and the creek running clear and reliable in its channel to the north. The life they had built was not quiet. It was not simple. It was not without its dark passages and its hard seasons, and the ordinary, irreducible difficulty of loving people in a world that was sometimes cruel and indifferent, and that did not guarantee any of the things that mattered most. But it was steady. It was genuinely, deliberately, achingly steady in the way that Isaiah Ralston had set out to be before he fully understood what steady was for, in the way that Jane Whitaker had stopped believing was possible before a letter arrived from a man in the eastern part of the territory, whose 4th paragraph had changed the entire trajectory of her life. The stars came out over the high desert of New Mexico territory, enormous and extravagant as they always were over that particular sweep of land, and Jane and Isaiah stood at their fence line and watched them come, one by one, like promises being kept. In the spring of 1881, the ranch had grown to 400 acres. Isaiah had purchased the adjacent property when the owner moved to California, not overextending but growing deliberately, with the same measured approach he brought to everything. Eli, 18 years old and now a genuine partner in the operation, had overseen the negotiation of the purchase with a competence that made the seller comment afterward to Abernathy, who was still sheriff and who had become over the years something close to a friend, that the Ralston boy had a good head on his shoulders. Abernathy had, according to Jane when she heard about it, corrected the man on the name only once. "He is a Whitaker by birth," Abernathy had said, "and a Ralston by everything else. Both count." Thomas Isaiah was 7 and in a state of permanent passionate interest in horses, cattle, weather, the territorial history that Tomás had been teaching him since he could listen, and the inexhaustible subject of what the mountains looked like at different times of day. He was, Jane thought, going to be either a rancher or a poet, and the distinction might not matter much. Clara was 3 and a confirmed commander of everything within her reach, which was, increasingly, a considerable radius. On a morning in April, Jane sat at the kitchen table with Isaiah over their coffee in the first light, the household still quiet, and she looked at him across the table. This man she had met through a desperate letter and married in a plain office in a frontier town, and built a life with in the high desert years of New Mexico territory. And she thought about what she would have missed if she had not written that letter, if she had been too afraid, if she had settled for something less than the truth about what she needed. She thought about Thomas Whitaker, who had been imperfect and charming and beloved and lost too soon, and who was present in his son's face, and in the name on the cradle that was already being outgrown, and who she had loved in the way she had been capable of loving at 19, which was genuinely, if incompletely. She thought about the version of herself who had sat in the dark calculating dollars and making desperate plans, and she felt for that woman not pity but gratitude, because that woman had been brave enough to reach for something real. "What are you thinking?" Isaiah said. She looked at him. The morning light was coming through the east window and catching the silver that was beginning to come in at his temples, and his face was weathered and familiar and entirely, completely her favorite face in the world. "I am thinking," she said, "that we have done something remarkable." "The ranch is doing well," he agreed. "I do not mean the ranch." He looked at her. He knew what she meant. He always knew. "Yes," he said. He reached across the table, the same gesture she had made to him in those early weeks when they were still finding their way toward each other, and covered her hand with his. "We have." From the back of the house came the sound of Thomas waking up, which always announced itself as a significant event, followed immediately by Clara's voice making her own position known. Isaiah squeezed her hand and rose to put more coffee on for the morning ahead, and Jane sat in the kitchen of the home she had built in the high desert and listened to her family come alive around her, and felt, with the full force of complete and grateful certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The wide sky outside the window was going from gray to pink to gold. The cattle were moving in the south pasture. The creek was running clear in its channel. The mountain stood blue and permanent to the north. The day was beginning as it always did, as it would continue to do, steady as the man who had taught her what that word truly meant. She put her hand over her heart for one private moment and said silently to the woman she had been 5 years ago in the dark with her $4.23 and her cracked axle wagon and her grieving boy, "You did the right thing. You were brave enough. Look at what you found." Then she got up from the table and went to help her husband with breakfast, and outside, Eli Whitaker came out of the bunkhouse in the early morning light, 18 years old and tall and serious and entirely himself, and crossed the yard toward the barn with the same deliberate, unhurried step he had learned from watching a man who had shown him, day after day and year after year, exactly what steady looked like. And the morning opened around them all, full and clear and unafraid.